Imagine two brothers, heroes, who together defeated an unstoppable foreign invader. They are celebrated, powerful, and stand at the pinnacle of their world. But in the shadow of their victory, a poison begins to grow, a poison of jealousy, arrogance, and fear. One brother is a brilliant artist and thinker, a champion of freedom and democracy, whose city is a beacon of culture. The other is a stoic, unbreakable warrior, a master of discipline and war, whose society is a fortress forged in blood and iron. Soon, their suspicion turns to hatred, and they turn their swords on each other, plunging their world into a catastrophic, generation-spanning civil war that will leave their entire civilization in ruins. This is not a myth. This is the true story of Athens and Sparta. This is the story of the Peloponnesian War, the war that broke Greece. In the aftermath of the heroic Greco-Persian Wars, Athens entered its golden age. Fueled by a new sense of confidence and the wealth of its allies, the city transformed into the cultural and intellectual heart of the ancient world. The Parthenon rose on the Acropolis, a testament to their devotion and power. Philosophers like Socrates questioned the nature of reality in the agora, while playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides invented tragedy on the stage. The Athenian experiment in direct democracy, for all its flaws, became a beacon of freedom and citizen rule. To protect against a future Persian invasion, Athens had formed the Delian League, a naval alliance of Greek city-states across the Aegean. Initially, it was a partnership of equals, but over the next 30 years, this defensive alliance began to look more and more like an Athenian empire. Allies who tried to leave, like the island of Naxos, were brutally suppressed. Their tribute, meant for a common defense, was seized and used to fund the magnificent building projects in Athens and to pay Athenian citizens for public service. Athens became the judge, jury, and executioner of the League, its fleet the enforcer of its will. In the south, in the stark, militaristic valleys of Laconia, the land-based power of Sparta watched with growing suspicion and fear. Sparta, the leader of its own rival alliance, the Peloponnesian League, was Athens's opposite in every way. It was an oligarchy ruled by kings and elders, a society built not on art and philosophy, but on the unbreakable discipline of the phalanx. Sparta and its allies saw Athens not as a partner, but as a tyrant, a rogue state whose ambition threatened to consume all of Greece. The final spark came from a series of proxy conflicts and trade disputes involving their respective allies, Corinth and Corcyra. The tension, simmering for decades, finally boiled over. The stage was set for a monumental clash of ideologies, a collision between two incompatible ways of life that would tear the Greek world apart. The conflict that erupted in 431 BCE was a strategic nightmare, a war between what one historian called an elephant and a whale. Athens, the whale, was a naval superpower. Its power was rooted in its massive fleet of over 300 triremes, the most advanced warships of their day. Fast, agile, and armed with a devastating bronze ram, the trireme was the key to Athens's control of the sea lanes, its vast trade network, and its utter domination of its island allies in the Delian League. The sea was Athens's sanctuary and its lifeline. Sparta, the elephant, was the undisputed master of land warfare. Its army, centered on the legendary hoplite phalanx, was the most feared and disciplined fighting force in Greece. The Spartan warrior, trained from birth in the brutal agoge, was a living weapon, a cog in a perfect killing machine. On an open field, no Greek army could stand against them. But their power ended at the water's edge. They had no significant navy and no experience in naval warfare. Neither side could strike a decisive blow against the other in its own element, creating a stalemate that promised a long, brutal war of attrition. The brilliant Athenian statesman Pericles devised a strategy to counter Sparta's overwhelming land-based strength. He knew the Spartans and their allies, led by their cautious king Archidamus, would invade their homeland of Attica each year to burn their crops and challenge them to a decisive battle. Pericles knew that meeting the Spartan phalanx on an open plain would be suicide for the Athenian army. So, he ordered an unprecedented and deeply unpopular move. The entire rural population of Attica was to abandon their farms, their homes, and their ancestral lands. They were to retreat and take refuge inside the Long Walls, a massive 5-mile-long set of fortifications that connected Athens to its port city of Piraeus. This feat of engineering transformed Athens into a virtual island. As long as the Athenian navy controlled the sea, the city could be resupplied with grain from the Black Sea indefinitely, making the annual Spartan invasion of their farmland completely irrelevant. The Spartans could burn olive groves and cut down vineyards, but they could not touch the true source of Athenian power: its fleet and its trade. While the Spartans ravaged the empty countryside, the Athenian fleet would act as a strategic scalpel. They would launch raids on the Peloponnesian coast, harassing Sparta's allies, disrupting their economy, and reminding them that nowhere was safe from the reach of Athenian naval power. Pericles' strategy was one of exhaustion. He would turn Athens into an impenetrable fortress, refuse to play Sparta's game, and use the city's naval supremacy and immense financial reserves to slowly bleed the Peloponnesian League dry. It was a cold, patient, and defensive strategy that required immense discipline from the famously impulsive Athenian people. A strategy built on the belief that Athens could simply outlast its enemy. For a time, Pericles' strategy worked. In the first year of the war, the Spartans invaded, the Athenians sheltered behind their walls, and the fleet projected its power across the Aegean. But in the second year of the war, a disaster far deadlier than any Spartan army struck the city. A horrific plague, its exact nature still debated by scientists, erupted within the overcrowded, unsanitary walls of Athens. Having packed the entire population of the countryside into the city, Pericles had inadvertently created the perfect breeding ground for disease. It spread like wildfire through the packed population. The historian Thucydides, an Athenian general who survived the plague himself, left a terrifying clinical account of its symptoms: raging fevers, uncontrollable thirst, violent vomiting, bleeding from the mouth, and a painful, agonizing death within a week. The plague killed nearly a third of the Athenian population, including thousands of soldiers, skilled sailors, and ordinary citizens. It was an indiscriminate killer that consumed the city's strength from within. The social order of the Golden Age collapsed under the weight of the pestilence. Men, seeing their imminent and unavoidable deaths, engaged in acts of lawless hedonism, believing there was no tomorrow. The sacred rites of burial were abandoned, as bodies were left to rot in the streets or piled onto massive funeral pyres. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned Athens. Most devastatingly for the war effort, the plague claimed the life of Athens' greatest leader, the one man who had the authority and wisdom to guide them through the storm, Pericles. The death of Pericles left a massive power vacuum in Athens that was filled by a new, more aggressive breed of politician, the demagogues. These were men who rose to power not through wisdom or experience, but by appealing to the rawest emotions of the democratic assembly: fear, anger, patriotism, and greed. The most prominent of these was a man named Cleon, a wealthy tanner by trade, a powerful speaker who advocated for a more brutal, offensive war. He saw Pericles' defensive strategy as cowardly and un-Athenian. This new, harsher policy was put on full display at the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, which had revolted from the Athenian Empire. After a long siege, the Athenians put down the revolt. In the assembly, Cleon, in a fiery speech, persuaded the enraged citizens to pass a horrifying decree to execute the entire adult male population of Mytilene and sell all the women and children into slavery. A trireme was dispatched to carry out the order. The next day, a wave of profound regret swept over the Athenians. They held another debate, and in a famous showdown between the brutal pragmatism of Cleon and the more humane arguments of a man named Diodotus, they narrowly voted to reverse the decree. A second trireme was sent in a desperate race against time, its crew rowing day and night. It arrived just as the first ship was preparing to carry out the massacre. While the people of Mytilene were spared, the incident revealed a dark and brutal turn in the city's character. The noble ideals of the Golden Age were being consumed by the savagery of total war. After a decade of bloody but indecisive fighting, a fragile peace was signed between Athens and Sparta. But the ambition of Athens could not be contained for long. The city's focus now turned to a new, incredibly wealthy prize, the island of Sicily and its most powerful city, Syracuse. The architect of this new grand strategy was a man named Alcibiades. He was a young, handsome, brilliant, and pathologically ambitious nobleman, a former student of Socrates and a relative of Pericles. He was also dangerously reckless and vain. Alcibiades mesmerized the Athenian assembly with a vision of imperial glory. He proposed launching a massive naval expedition to Sicily with the official goal of aiding their local allies on the island, but with the unspoken dream of conquering Syracuse and then all of Sicily. This, he argued, would provide Athens with immense wealth, fresh timber for ships, and new soldiers, tipping the balance of power against Sparta for good. The elder, more cautious general, Nicias, who had brokered the peace, argued passionately against the expedition, warning of its immense cost and risks. But the assembly, drunk on Alcibiades' charisma, not only approved the plan, but voted to make the expedition even larger and more powerful. The Sicilian Expedition of 415 BCE was a spectacle of unparalleled power and confidence. Over 130 triremes, thousands of hoplites, and a vast train of supply ships set sail from Piraeus harbor. It was, as Thucydides wrote, the most expensive and splendid force a single Greek city had ever put to sea. The entire city turned out to watch its departure, a moment of supreme imperial pride. But the campaign was cursed from the start. Just before the fleet departed, a number of sacred religious statues in Athens, the Hermae, were systematically vandalized in a single night. It was a terrible omen, and suspicion immediately fell on Alcibiades and his aristocratic friends. Fearing a political trial and a death sentence, Alcibiades made a fateful choice. He defected. In an act of stunning betrayal, Athens' most brilliant commander fled to, of all places, Sparta. He revealed the full scope of the Sicilian plan and gave the Spartans the two pieces of advice that would doom his own city: First, he told them to send their best general to Syracuse to help the Sicilians organize their defense. Second, he advised them to establish a permanent fort in Attica itself, at a place called Decilia, allowing them to raid the Athenian countryside year-round. In Sicily, the Athenian expedition, now led by the reluctant and indecisive Nicias, descended into a nightmare. The Athenians were outmaneuvered by the Syracusans, who were now being advised and led by the brilliant Spartan general, Gylippus. After 2 years of disastrous campaigning, bogged down in a failed siege, the Athenians found their own fleet trapped in the great harbor of Syracuse. In a final desperate naval battle, their once mighty navy was annihilated. The surviving 40,000 soldiers, attempting to flee overland, were hunted down. Most were killed, and the thousands who were captured were condemned to a horrific death, working as slaves in the open-air stone quarries of Syracuse, where they died of exposure and starvation. An entire army and an entire fleet had been utterly destroyed. The news of the Sicilian disaster was a death blow to Athens. The city was plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. They had lost tens of thousands of their best soldiers and skilled rowers and over 200 ships, a massive portion of their fleet. Their treasury was empty. Seeing their weakness, allies across the Aegean, who had long resented Athenian rule, began to revolt. But the most decisive change came from the old enemy, Persia. The Persian Empire, seeing a chance to reclaim its influence in the Greek world, began to provide Sparta with a massive resource it had always lacked: gold. With Persian gold, the Spartans did the unthinkable. They built a navy. Led by a brilliant and ruthless admiral named Lysander, this new Spartan fleet could finally challenge Athens on its own element. Lysander was the antithesis of the stereotypical Spartan. He was a cunning political operator as well as a skilled naval commander. He understood that to defeat Athens, he had to cut off its lifeline. The final phase of the war became a grueling naval struggle for control of the Hellespont, the vital strait that supplied Athens with the grain from the Black Sea that it needed to survive. The final decisive and almost pathetic battle came in 405 BCE at a place called Aegospotami. The Athenian fleet, through a combination of arrogance, carelessness, and incompetence, had beached their ships on an open shore to forage for supplies. The Spartan admiral Lysander, watching from a nearby harbor, saw his opportunity. He launched a surprise attack, catching the entire Athenian fleet completely off guard. The battle was a massacre. Nearly the entire fleet of 180 ships was captured on the beach almost without a fight. The few commanders who had warned of the danger, like the General Conon, barely escaped. With its last great navy destroyed, Athens was now defenseless. Lysander sailed his new powerful fleet to the port of Piraeus and blockaded the city. The Spartans, for the first time in the war, marched their army right up to the walls of Athens and began a final, brutal siege. Starvation set in. The proud city that had once ruled an empire, the cultural capital of the world, was now on its knees, completely at the mercy of its most hated enemy. In 404 BCE, after 27 years of brutal, self-destructive warfare, the city of Athens unconditionally surrendered. The victors were merciless. Sparta's most powerful allies, like Corinth and Thebes, still bitter from decades of war, demanded that Athens be destroyed completely and its people sold into slavery, just as Athens had once done to others. They wanted to raze the city to the ground and turn the land into a sheep pasture. The fate of the city that had given the world democracy and philosophy hung by a thread. But the Spartans, in a rare act of reverence for the past, refused. They declared they would not put out one of the eyes of Greece, the city that had once played such a glorious role in saving them all from the Persians. However, they did impose harsh and humiliating terms. The Athenian Empire was formally dismantled. All overseas territories were forfeited. The remaining ships of the Athenian navy were surrendered. The massive long walls, the symbol of Athenian power and Pericles' strategy, were to be torn down. The historian Xenophon wrote that the walls were demolished by the cheering victors to the sound of flute music, as they believed it was the first day of freedom for Greece. Finally, the Athenian democracy was abolished, replaced by a brutal oligarchy of 30 men loyal to Sparta, who would become known as the 30 Tyrants. The reign of the 30 Tyrants was a brief but horrific period of terror. They executed over 1,000 citizens, confiscated the property of many more, and drove thousands into exile. Although Athenian democracy would eventually be restored, the city's spirit was broken. The confidence, wealth, and power of the Golden Age were gone forever. The Peloponnesian War was a catastrophe from which ancient Greece would never truly recover. The constant warfare had depleted the wealth and manpower of every major city-state. The political landscape was shattered, leaving a power vacuum that would lead to decades of further, inconclusive fighting between Sparta, Thebes, and a resurgent but weakened Athens. This endemic weakness, this inability of the Greek city-states to unite, was being watched closely by a rising, ambitious power to the north. King Philip II of Macedon saw a collection of exhausted, broken cities ripe for conquest. The war that Athens and Sparta had fought to determine who would rule Greece had, in the end, ensured that neither of them would. They had only succeeded in opening the door for a new master who would unite Greece not by consensus, but by the sword. The Peloponnesian War stands as a timeless and tragic warning of how arrogance, fear, and ambition can lead a civilization to self-destruct. The glories of the Golden Age were consumed in a fire of their own making, leaving a legacy of ruin that would change the world forever. If you were captivated by this epic story of a clash of empires, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And now, for our final question. Who do you believe was more responsible for the war, the ambitious expansion of Athens, or the fearful paranoia of Sparta? Let us know your verdict in the comments below. Thanks for watching.